Rim Turkmani.
Good evening. So my story starts with my grandmother over here. She was born about 100 years ago. She never made it into formal education, but she was very fascinated by history. And she used to take me around the old city of Aleppo, where she was born, and tell me fascinating stories behind every building and every stone. And she managed herself to get her daughter, my mother, into the formal education. And she made it as high up to the master level and managed to get 3 university degrees. My mother, in her turn, she managed to get her 2 daughters, that's me and my sister, into PhD level. I had to look back at my childhood pictures to prepare for this talk, and it was very, very painful. I had amazing childhood, very happy childhood, growing up in Homs, where I was born, visiting Damascus, Aleppo, everywhere in Syria, and there isn't one single picture that is not spoiled now by the war. The site of this picture became known in Homs as the site of the Gardenia sniper. It's a place where mortar shells were launched at the civilians in the old city. This picture in the temple of Baal in Palmyra, the temple that stood there for thousands of years, and then it was torn up into 1,000 pieces by ISIS. This picture is in my favorite playground, me and my sister. This playground became now the site of a massacre, where a bomb was dropped on children and their families while they were playing. This is my first secondary school. I'm over there. That school was turned into a detention center. My second secondary school, called Granada, my mother was the headmistress, it was turned into a shelter to host the internally displaced people. So in conclusion, so many children in Syria had to wait. They cannot get an education because their schools were either destroyed or turned into shelters or something else. We had an entire generation missing on education, not only inside Syria, but also out in the refugee camps. But I was one of the lucky ones. I made it through this education, but I was so determined that I want to pursue science. I want to become a scientist, a physicist, an astrophysicist. And I knew that in Syria, I cannot do that. I cannot become person who produces new knowledge. And it's all about knowledge production. It's no point for me going to Damascus, study, just repeat the knowledge that people produce and not be able to become part of an institution that puts me at the frontiers of scientific research. So I had to fly the nest, and I went to Sweden. Fast forward, 2003, I obtained my PhD in theoretical astrophysics from Chalmers University in Technology in the city of Gothenburg. And I was given this ring. This is my favorite piece of jewelry, which they give to those who get their PhD from Chalmers to wear in pride. Now, on this ring, you see the date of my graduation. That was in June 2003. A week after that, I started my first job at the Imperial College in London, and I stayed there for around 10 years as an astrophysicist. While I was at the Imperial College, I was awarded the most prestigious scientific fellowship, which is the Dorothy Hodgkin Fellowship of the Royal Society. The fellowship enabled me to do what I want in science, just exactly what I want, the time that I want to do it. And the Royal Society is really the foundation or the institute where the modern science was founded. This is the institute that was founded by people like Boyle and Newton and Halley, and it was really where, kind of modern science as we know it was born. So the Royal Society not only motivated me to produce a new scientific knowledge, but also it awakened my grandmother in me. So I went back to history of science. So in parallel to my scientific work, I started doing more work on the history of science. I started going back to Syria and digging into the libraries and mosques and discover new astronomical tools and talk about them and discover new manuscripts and talk about what is known about like the golden era of the Arabic Islamic science, sometimes between the 8th and the 14th century when that part of the world was very active in knowledge production. And I used to go around producing documentaries, talking about this beautiful period, give talks, write did all kind of things. This was during 2010. There was in Aleppo, at the Grand Mosque of Aleppo, where I was talking in front of a sundial, because mosques back then were always housing timekeepers and astronomers, and they had sundials in every mosque. And we produced a documentary that came out of this. That was the last day I visited Syria. Because shortly after, the revolution started, and I took a position that made me persona non grata in my own country. The mosque itself was heavily destroyed, and its minaret that was standing there for 1,200 years was torn apart into pieces by rocket. Back into London, 2 years before that, a page in this book turned a new page in my life. I was at the Royal Society, and the head of the Qatar Foundation, Sheikh Hamoza, was due to visit for a meeting to negotiate a relationship with the society. And they invited me for a meeting to be on the side of the Royal Society. And after the meeting, the librarian made a small exhibition to impress Sheikh Hamoza of Arabic books, very old Arabic books from their own library. And they opened up this charter book. This is the book where every new fellow of the Royal Society would sign when he became a very proud fellow. And on that page, there were 3 signatures in Arabic from 1700, and no one knew what are these signatures doing there. So I started digging this up and say, what is behind this? And I realized that actually back then, they appointed 3 fellows from the Arab world to become fellows of the Royal Society. And I was like, why did they do this? They were not interested in history and literature back then. It was about making science. And I realized that actually these fellows did contribute to knowledge production. One of them, for example, introduced the inoculation, which is like the vaccination against smallpox, into England. And those Arabic books, what were they doing there? So I went down to their archive. They gave me access to all their archives, and I realized there were so many old Arabic books down in their library. And then I had access to the correspondences of the Royal Society Fellows, and then I discovered the whole story. So back then, 350 years ago, when Europe was very advanced in science, it's not the Renaissance, when back then, the Renaissance, yes, Europe was naturally picking up from the Arab world, because that's where kind of science ended, and they picked up from there. This is 17th century, where they're very advanced, so why would they go back and look into this knowledge again? So that led me to a new research, where I discovered so many amazing, amazing stories, and I realized that those fellows were actually very, very actively engaged in going back to the Arab world, finding these books, translating them, learning Arabic themselves, like Hali himself. He knew Arabic, he translated from Arabic, and then used this knowledge in producing a new science. They would write to people in the Arab world. All scientists would go to the Arab world and write back to them, oh, listen, I learned that in Egypt you can incubate chicken eggs on an industrial scale. That's how you do it. Or so many like these kind of amazing stories. So I thought I have to tell this to everyone. So I turned this story into an exhibition. 2 years later, I opened the exhibition at the Royal Society. I called it Arabic Roots, Arabic with CK, because that's the 17th century spelling of the word. And that's Sir Paul North, the head of the Royal Society. I was giving him that green book over there, which I produced with the exhibition. The exhibition lasted for 6 months. It is from the opening. I showed all these amazing books and correspondences and astronomical tools. So many school children visited there, and that was the thing that made me so happy, taking them around, telling all these stories. But I thought, I can make more out of this story. So I turned it into a much more colorful exhibition a year later, which opened in Doha at the Museum of Islamic Art in 2012. Where I brought other elements to the story from the same period. Elements have to do more with lifestyle, with art, with popular culture. So this is the cover of the book that also came up with this exhibition, and it was much more, colorful one. So for example, I brought the textile from the Arab world. I showed how English gentlemen used to dress kind of with the kind of Orientalist style. I showed how knowledge about how to breed racing horses was also being imported. And so many fascinating stories showed how astronomical tools were also used in that historical context. Lots of fascinating stories. And I was very happy, as you can see from all these pictures, and that was it. Back then, when the exhibition finished in early 2013, already things turned in Syria into full-blown civil war. 150 people were dying a day, and I thought, this is a luxury. I just can't do this anymore. So that was it. I put everything on the shelf, my science, the history, everything. I was already negotiating a book contract to write about all this historical research, and I thought, that's it. That's not the time. I have to do something for my country. The only thing I could do was do research. That's what I know, how to do the best. So I started writing research about Syria, trying to understand exactly what's going on and publishing this research. And somehow, not sure exactly how, I ended up now, 5 years later, heading 2 major research programs at the London School of Economic and Political Science, looking into the conflict in Syria, trying to understand the conflict dynamics, trying to bring the local perspective also into the policy-making world. I do lots of advocacy based on my research, so I go to all international platforms, the UN, everywhere else, and I speak about the findings. And it's not something that I enjoy. Probably shows here on my face. I have to do it. It's out of duty. I'd much rather go back to science or do that, dig up these beautiful historical stories. But I feel out of duty, I have to do this now. The one thing, though, that makes me happy is to engage with these beautiful children, with the refugee children. And I go regularly there to the camps, and I engage with the children. This one was in Turkey. And they are the most amazing creatures. Here's another picture from a camp in Lebanon. Inside the school in the camp. So it's dark because these schools and the camps are all inside dark tents. They can't have windows to have natural light. They have to be sealed. This is in the Bekaa Valley, very close to one of the schools that Hands Up Foundation support. And I managed to recruit my 2 children into this cause. So you can see here in the background is my daughter engaging with she shows here, she's engaging with a refugee child. And here's another picture with my son in the front, my husband in the background. This is another one in Jordan, actually. We visited refugee children who were amputated as well, and my children took them to the Science Children Museum for a trip. They are amazing, amazing children, and it's extremely difficult to provide them with education, especially the ones in the camp in the Bekaa Valley, where often the tents fall apart under the heavy snow. It's an extremely difficult thing to do, but it's so well worth supporting. And Hands Up Foundation is doing the hard job of providing education to some of these children. And I think you can do the easy job of donating to them or talking about their cause, as my children do. They go around, now my son and daughter, they go around the schools, they speak about the refugee children, they make collections of books and toys and send it to them. They donate their own pocket money to support their children. And I'm sure if my 2 kids were able to do it, I'm sure you can do it as well. I'll finish with one little secret. So, yes, it saddens me a lot that I haven't been able for a while to pursue my science, and I keep asking myself, so what happened to the scientist me? When am I going to go back? Am I dead as a scientist? And then to lift my spirit up, I go to the server of Harvard server of the astronomy and astrophysics research papers, and I put my name up there and click, and it comes all the papers that I produced when I was at the Imperial. And then I click at the citation, where it shows if someone is using my papers now, they're building on these bricks that I built and use them to produce new knowledge. And I find that, yes, they are still regularly using what I produced. So this is one paper I went into yesterday into that server, and I looked into one of my papers. So it was cited more than 80 times. And I looked at the history. So last time was this year in August, again twice back in February, and so forth. So it tells me that I'm still alive there. There are still people building on that little brick that I put there. And that's the beauty of knowledge production. It keeps you alive, even if you drop it, even if you're no longer, it drops you alive. It keeps you alive. Thank you very much.